Hello and welcome to the part number 53 of the Node Editor tutorial series. My name is Pavel Kropala from BlenderFreak.com, and today we are going to have a look at all of these changes I've made so far to be able to use this library. So there is going to be some cleanup, bunch of fixes, and the rest will allow us to override or reuse the code. So I hope you are excited, and let's go through the changes. So one of the first things I wanted to do was to be able to change the color of the socket. So I just moved these constants out of the init assets and made them here above the class and added the new method called getSocketColor. So if you call this one now, you can pass in the index or you can pass in the string and it will immediately create a Q color for you out of the string. So you can pass something like this specific, or you can override the graphic socket on your own and provide your own functionality to determine which socket color should be there. So here was a little bit of cleanup, and as the next thing we got the dump exception, and we were calling that with a parameter. We were passing the exception here. However, it's not necessary in our case, so I'm just printing the exception with the tracespec itself. Anyways, if you do want to pass in your exceptions or resend them, for example, to server or somewhere else, or log it to a file, you can use also this commented code here. I wanted to be able to override the scene class, so here in the Node Editor widget, I created a new class variable and called it scene class, which got later renamed to scene_class, but whatever. Right now, this will allow you to override your Node Editor widget and pass in your own scene class, which you can override from the scene. So here is the change. And as the next one, I did some kind of a debugging here in the add nodes, so there is another node for testing purposes. That's not interesting too much. I also wanted to fix the copy pasting of settings, so here in the node scene clipboard I just added a new debug pasting to split up the comments a little bit, changed a few of them here which were wrong, and here are some changes in the deserialize from clipboard method. So last time we were trying to position all of our nodes, which we are pasting, around our cursor. So imagine if the cursor is somewhere here, we were trying to calculate the bounding box of all pasted nodes and put them somewhat around the mouse cursor. So basically the mouse cursor was supposed to be somewhere in the middle of the bounding box. That got changed, and now we do still calculate the bounding box. However, your mouse cursor is gonna point in the left top corner of the bounding box or the pasted nodes. And another thing I thought about was that it would be really nice if you paste some nodes that they could be selected automatically for you once you do the pasting. So for that, since do select items was triggering a bunch of events for us already, I can modify the scene, and now we are using set silent selection events, which is a flag, and this flag allows us to postpone the triggering of the, or basically maybe just say cancel the triggering of the selection events itself. So once we do call do select and we did set the silent selection events on the scene, the do select won't be triggering any events for us. So that's the major change here. So we got set silent selection events, we are deselecting everything. Once we deserialize all the nodes, we are selecting them, and at the end we just remove the flag again, and we are returning the list of all created nodes. So if we have a look in the scene, as you can see, some of the cleanup, remove warnings, etc. And here is our flag. So custom flag that is used for triggering on item selected, which does a bunch of stuff. really useful command. Anyways, we got the set silent selection events. This is just a setter of the flag to true or false, and the on item selected got changed a little bit. Here is a statement, so if the silent selection event is true, then we are returning, and we are not going through all of the code we had here before. So this is suppressing all of our item selected listeners. These remain the same, I guess, and just the change in the documentation. Okay, we got a new function do deselect items, which is going through all of the selected items and does deselect them for us. And it also supports the silent parameter. And what's next? Here is just some change to make it a little bit more readable. And also I wanted to have the possibility to override the graphical socket itself. So I went to the socket class, and here, as you can see, we got a new class variable called socket gr class. So now when we override the socket, we can put in the socket gr class equals to another overridden class of the graphic socket. The same way we are doing that stuff here in the calculator example. As you can see, we are using the calc node and the icon, OP code and stuff like that. So this way we can easily override our graphical socket. And let's go through the changes. Here is some cleanup in the debug. Here you can see the change. Maybe at some point of time it would be nice to create also a method called like get gr socket class or something to be able to provide the user the possibility to override it like this or with a function. However, we got a new delete method here, and this one is deleting the socket from the scene, and this makes sure that also the graphical socket is being removed from the scene, since throughout the deserialization I had some problems with the graphical sockets that stayed in the node. So this is a helper function for that, and also we can ask the socket if it has any edge. If it does one, this is going to return true, otherwise we are gonna get false. Also we can ask if this socket is connected to some edge, and here is the edge. So another helper function and bunch of cleanup. And also remove all edges got now the option to be called with silent, and if this one is silent, we are just removing the edge silently. Okay, so moving to the next change, here is the fixed Bezier edge curving, and I wanted to clean up some dependencies also, since the node graphic edge doesn't need the node socket anymore. I just removed this line, and a bunch of the other changes affected are gonna be here in this commit later. So moving back here another comment changed, fixed some documentation, and just here at the end where we are calculating the path for the graphic edge Bezier, we did some calculation according to the position of the sockets. However, we can modify this later easily and decide maybe that it's going to that the inputs should be not on the left but on the right, etc. So basically we can actually ask the socket itself if it is input socket or if it is output socket. So the change is according to this information stored in the socket. Since we started to use it, we can use it even here now. Moving along, the graphical node got improved a little bit, so now we are again changed some comments and we have a new method called mouse double click event. This is a standard PyQt5 event, and we are passing that one to the node, so we can use that. And also here are some pixel tweaks for the outline in the painting method for the graphics node. So now to the bigger changes. And let me start with the edge here. So since we removed the line here, let me show it again to clean up the dependencies. The node editor node socket here. Now here is what is gonna change. In the node edge, I edit these imports to be able to use that. And also here we were using the scene string already, but we can't use the socket right now since we removed that from the import. So rather than using two different systems and referring to the socket class itself, let's just use the string here. Moving to the next change, we got other socket. Now again the same change. We got update position. Here are some comments, and remove has been changed a little bit. So now we can call the edge remove, and we can surpass or make it silent for some kind of socket we know already. So if we pass some kind of a socket here, when we are notifying the nodes from the old socket, we will check if we pass the silent for socket. If we do pass some socket here, and we detect the socket, we will skip the notification of on edge connection changed or on input change for those sockets, or for that socket we passed as a parameter here to the remove edge. And as a next thing, I just had a problem with the serialization and deserialization of some edges. So right now we are, just to be sure, we are checking if the start socket is none, and if it is, and we are serializing this edge, we will be passing none in the start and end here. Okay, this was simple enough. So let me go back here and let's go to the node. So to be able to control the node, we got a new class variables graphic node class, node content class, and the socket class. And if you create your own node, now you can override these values and pass in your own overridden classes here. Either you can do this here, or you can just change these methods. Get node content class, which is returning the class of your node content, and also the get graphic node class, which is this one. So either you can change these values or these methods, override them, or you can just override these class variables. It does depend completely on you, and you can use either of those systems. To have better control of the sockets, I just added the sockets offset, which is basically calculating the offsets of the socket for better positioning. Here is the change necessary to be able to use the socket class, some cleanup of the prints, and we got the on double clicked, which is the new event being passed from the GR node. Also a helper method is selected, so this is going to be true if the node is actually selected. Calculating the socket position according to the offsets. And as the next thing, we got eval with index, which wasn't here before, and we got get input and get input with socket and get input with socket index. So what are these changes about? Basically, so far we were calculating with node which got only one output, which is completely fine, and we can use just an eval function for that, and everything will be working fine. However, imagine that we got something like an image node, and we want to return multiple outputs or multiple versions of an output of this node. For example, in the case of image, we would, for example, return RGB value, and then the channels itself, so the red channel, green channel and blue channel. So therefore there is an index. So once we call this image nodes evaluation, we can pass in the index from 0 to any number we want, which will determine which socket we want to evaluate with this node. So therefore, if you are still using the node with one single output, there will be index equal to 0 and you don't need to care about that. However, if you got multiple outputs, we can specify with the index which value of the node output we actually want. So therefore, to help and ease the evaluation of the nodes, we also can ask for the inputs connected to the node. So the get input is a little bit cleaned up. And also here are new versions which we can use. So we can ask for the input itself by the index, or we can just ask for the input with socket, and therefore we will get the node itself and the socket connected. Or we can just ask the input with socket index, and therefore we are returning the node and the index of the socket connected there. So when I was testing this particular part of code and I did have a node which got, let's say, 3 outputs and 2 inputs, and I was trying to deserialize or load from the file another version of the same node with a different number of sockets, I noticed that the graphical sockets were remaining there in the scene already. That means that it's a bug and definitely not a behavior we want. So basically we got two options how to solve this issue. If we create first the sockets and then we are trying to deserialize the data and the sockets are different, we can basically, in the first case, we can delete and create completely new sockets. So that would mean when we were loading a socket or actually a node from a file, that would mean that we will basically create them twice. So this is one option how to use that. However, we can do that a little bit more clever and we can reuse the sockets which already exist. So that means when we are deserializing the data for the sockets now, we are going through all of the input sockets already created, and if they do exist, we can keep them, and if we don't have the sockets yet, we can create them. And the same goes for the outputs here. And at the end, few simple changes. So here in the node editor window, the create menus, since it was creating all the file and all the edit menu, I split them up into two different functions. So there's nothing special about that. And here at the end, in the edit paste, we are returning what we got from the deserialize from clipboard. So if you remember correctly, we are now here returning the list of newly created nodes. So this one is gonna return now. And here, just also for the node editor window, instead of setting up the geometry like that, so force it to be on position 200 200 and the size window of 800 by 600, we just commented this out, and the size hint is gonna set a default size of the window to 800 by 600 for you. So this way the window should appear in the middle of your current screen. And finally, let's go ahead to our calculator example and try to get these changes here also. So if you remember, we added the class variables to be able to override the graphical node and node content classes, so we can use them here now instead of overriding the init inner classes method like we did before. So this is one change. And the second change, we went through the one input changed, and instead of passing edge, we started to pass a socket here. So therefore we are going to make this change too. As the next one, I'm gonna talk about the calculator window. since I was trying to use PyQt 5.14 and I noticed that even though you close the application, so when you are running the close event, the application in 5.13 versions of PyQt did close up, but in 5.14 it does hang out. I'm not entirely sure why it's still happening. However, here is a quick way how to hack it so the application closes for you. So you can basically import sys and call exit with the return code 0. However, I spent a few days trying to debug what's going on there, and I got so far that I noticed that when you create the Q proxy widget, which is being used for the widgets inside of Q graphic scene, then the application for some reason keeps hanging in the memory and it didn't close. So hopefully I will figure that out later, but for now, if you do need to use PyQt 5.14 or upper version, then you can try this, it might help you. So moving along to the calculator subwindow, which is our node editor widget. First of all, I commented this line here, since it doesn't seem to do too much in our case, and I also tried to somehow clean up or divide the handle new node context menu, which was written here. So I basically split it up. We are using some helper functions called determine target socket of a node, which is being used here for the target socket, as you can see. And also, when the target socket is not none, we are finishing the new node state, which is a bunch of these functions here. Since they can be reused from other places, I just move them here and try to clean up the handle new node context menu as such. So as the next thing, I wanted to be able to change the socket color at the runtime. So if you remember correctly, we still do follow our architecture in that way that we got a socket which handles the logic of a socket, and also we got the graphic socket which handles the rendering of it. So let's have a look in the first one, and I noticed that we are trying to create a graphic socket with a reference to the socket itself and the socket type, and we are trying to store that value, which is not necessary since this value is already stored in the socket, so therefore it got removed. And here we got a new property called socket type, which is pointing to the socket class for the socket type. So we keep this value in one single place, and here is a new method called change socket type, which does change the color of the graphical socket just by this method getSocketColor. And also we are calling the self.update on this class, which is a QGraphics item, which does mean that after calling this one, this graphical item will get repainted. So if we now look to the socket itself, here is the construction of the graphical socket here in the constructor, and also there is a new function called change socket type. Here you can pass a new value, so socket.change socket type, new type of the socket, and if that one is gonna be different, we are going to store the new value, and also we are calling the graphical socket change socket type, which does the repainting in the graphic scene. Next thing I wanted to change a little bit are the open and save dialogs for our graphs we are using. So what I basically did, I went to the file open here, and in this method, if we do pass the first and fourth parameter here, so this one is going to contain a string where the directory should be when we do this operation. So that means on file open. So where we are should look first once we do file open dialog. And the second one is the get file dialog filter. And basically I can show you if I run the example. Now if I do open, as you can see, I got looking somewhere here in this particular folder. Since I'm not setting that up, it's just empty string. We are looking at the application root. However, here is the file dialog filter, which does look like graph.json and all files. So to be able to get this file dialog filter, I went ahead to the node editor and I created these two methods, which can be overridden by you. So here you can specify any logic you want. For example, you could remember the old opened directory and pass it in the next time. And here you can change what you should see or what the user should see in the filter on the bottom right side for your application. So by default this is gonna be called from the file open and also the file save, as you can see in the change here. As the next thing, once I started to override the sockets, I noticed that it's not working in some cases. So I went ahead to the node graphic view and first of all added a new last seen mouse position, where we are storing the last mouse position for later use. And also the problem of not detecting the sockets was caused by this one, since we are asking directly if the item we clicked on is type of QDM graphic socket. However, if we derive from the graphic socket, is not gonna be that type, so therefore we need to use is instance of QDM graphic socket. That means this one or any derived one. Moving next, I just made it a little bit cleaner in the mouse move event. So here we go. Since we are using the scene position map to scene on both of the if conditions here, I move it up and I cleaned up a little bit this code. Moving to the next change, here is a new comment. Here is a to do. We can actually try maybe later to implement it. And here another change of is instance instead of type to be able to detect the sockets. Here again few more comments, so it makes a little bit more sense. And also here on input changed we are passing socket instead of new edge. And moving along with the changes, I wanted to be able to override the node editor widget and also the node window. So therefore here in the node editor widget I wanted to make it a little bit more consistent. So here is the rename of scene class to scene_class to remain somehow consistent with the rest of the code. And also the change need to be here in the init UI. And then here, as we are using the add nodes for testing, I wanted to quickly test somehow a node with empty content or different versions of the content. So here is a quick testing code of a hacky way how to create a new node content with the new node, etc. So you can ignore that or use that as an example, but this is supposed to be that code which is gonna be removed sooner or later. So in the node editor window, here we got new node editor widget class, which is pointing to the node editor widget. Therefore, changes also here instead of forcefully trying to use node editor widget all the time. So you can override now the node editor widget. Next, I wanted to test out the node which got empty content. So I went ahead here to the node, and as you can see, by default we are setting the content and GR node, so the graphical node, to be none. In case it doesn't get overridden, we will keep none values here. So the next change is in these init inner classes. So we are trying to somehow get the node class and node content class and the graphic node class. So if they are not none, we are setting the new self content or the graphic node. So moving to the next change, here we do serialization of the graphical content a little bit better. So only if it's instance of serializable, then we are going to call serialize. Otherwise we are going to put empty dictionary into the content when we do serialize our node. And then these are the changes with the graphical socket I was going through before, and I got rid of a bunch of the comments here and make it a little bit more readable. So at the end here we are also trying to deserialize our content of the node a little bit better. So if it's instance of serializable, then we are going to deserialize the content, otherwise we are gonna skip that. So the necessary changes also in the graphics node are that we are no longer using self-content equals to pointer to self-node content. We will do that differently. So here we got a new property called content, and this is gonna return none or self-node content. And the next change is here, again in some comment for the documentation and here in the init content. So now we are checking if the self-content is not none, and if it's not none, we are trying to set some kind of a geometry for it. And basically the rest of the code is doing exactly the same thing as on the left side. So before we were manually creating the QGraphics proxy widget, and then we were setting the geometry and the widget of the graphical content. Now we are doing basically the same thing. I did these changes even though they make the same thing, because I was trying to test out different ways how to get avoid of the hanging application I spoke before in PyQt 5.14. Let's talk about this last change here. So I wanted to just be able to call the edge remove silently, so I added this parameter here. So we can just skip the calling of the edge connection changed and input changed in case that we specify certain socket, or we can just call silent equals to true, and therefore we are going to skip these events completely. And this is being used here in the edge drag end. So when we are dragging an edge and we want to cancel that or end that one, we are going to remove the drag edge with silent equal to true. So these are bunch of changes, and I'm not 100% satisfied with all of them, especially the one mentioned here in the fixed bronc offset copy paste, since here I do not like the set silent selection events. However, maybe if it's the case that we can do select with the silent flag here and get rid of this flag in the scene itself, I will remove that in the future. However, for now, this is gonna be everything for this part. I thank you for watching and see you at the next part.